Well, Shabbat Shalom, good Shabbos, and happy Hanukkah to you all. So today is the third day of Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights. And as we know, the word Hanukkah means, if you'll put up my first slide there, it's an easy one. It means, what does it mean? It means dedication, the word Hanukkah, right? And this is why some New Testament translations translate the word in John 10 and say the Feast of Dedication, which actually, this is one of the few places that I wish, actually in most of the holidays, I think it's actually not helpful to translate it, because then nobody knows what it is, right? Most Christians don't realize that Hanukkah is mentioned in the New Testament, right? But because it doesn't say Hanukkah in most translations, it says the Feast of Dedication, they just skip right over it because they don't know what it is. Hanukkah and its associated stories, of course, are first recorded in the apocryphal books of Maccabees. The events surrounding Hanukkah took place during a turbulent time in Jewish history. Judea, which was also known as the land of Israel, came under the control of a crazy madman, Antiochus Epiphanes, around 168 BCE. And he outlawed the Jewish religion and ordered all Jews, of course, to worship the Greek gods. His soldiers descended upon Jerusalem, massacred hundreds of people, and desecrated the Holy Temple. But that's not how the story ends. There was an old priest, as we know, named Mattathias, and his sons who were faithful to God, and when in their town of Modin, were commanded to bow down before a statue of a Greek god and pledge loyalty to Antiochus, they refused. And in one of the key moments of the story, Mattathias slew the guards and the government official, and he declared, "Let all who are zealous for the Torah and support the covenant come with me." And what did they do? They fled into the hills, and loyal and courageous Jews heard of their courage, and they came from all over Judea and joined them. And they formed groups in order to fight the forces of Antiochus. Upon Mattathias' death, one of his sons, Judah, who was also called the Maccabee, was chosen to continue leading these Jewish forces. Although greatly outnumbered, ill-equipped, and lacking any proper military training, they overcame the well-trained and well-equipped professional army of Antiochus. Now, this word Maccabee, most of you know this, but for those who don't, Maccabee means what? Maccabi, it means a hammer, right? But it was also chosen as a rallying battle cry for the Maccabees because they saw in it an acronym for Mi Chamocha Be'elim Adonai. Who is you, O Lord, among the gods, among all the else that is worshipped, right? That Antiochus wanted the Jews to worship the Greek gods, but they said, we only serve one God who is greater than any of your gods, and so therefore, Maccabee, that's why they became known as the Maccabees, with this rallying battle cry, Mi Chamocha Be'elim Adonai, right, which is now still a part of the daily liturgy of the Jewish people. Now, I wanted to do something different today. Instead of just normally preach at you, we're going to do a little text study because most people have actually never read, we've read children's books and you've heard sermons, but most people have never actually read the accounts of the Maccabees. So what I want to do today is, we might not get to, I have 4 texts here, but we probably won't get to all of them. But let's take a look at, I'm going to pass these out into text, and we're going to look at a couple of texts. So I want you to, if you're sitting next to someone, get next to 2, at most maybe 3 people around you. So if you're sitting alone, just scoot over next to somebody, and we're going to look at these. So Paul, can I get you to help me pass these out? So in your little study, in your chavrutot, in your little chavrusa groups, take a look at text number 1. And I'm going to give you just a few minutes to look at text number 1, and then we'll think about what pops out to us. So go ahead, text number 1. Just go ahead and read it together, discuss it. If you've had a chance to read it, then discuss this among your group. The kind of questions you can ask, like, what's going on here, right? Who are the main players? Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? If you can really divide the world into such an easy... Sometimes we're all good guys and bad guys. Did you need another one? So just read text number 1. We're just going to focus on number 1. So you don't have to read the whole thing. Just the one that says 1 Maccabees 1. All right, sure. Like, do you want to, share an observation?
It starts with, it says a group of traitorous Jews there, right? So, and historically, that's the Hellenistic Jews who, they preferred Antiochus over the Maccabees. They identified as Greek, and they wanted to abandon Judaism and follow the Greek gods, and so the Maccabees first had to defeat them before they could defeat the Greek army.
Yeah, that's Michael made a great observation that along with these external forces, that Mattathias and those with him had to contend with the fact that there were Jews who were fine with this plan of outlawing Judaism. Now, remember, over time, all Jews are going to be Hellenized to one extent or another, but there were those who felt like, I can take on certain aspects of modern culture and still be committed to Jewish life. And then there were those who felt the opposite, that they wanted to be against Jewish life. And I still haven't figured this out, but they reversed their circumcision so they could compete in the games and stuff like this. And so this became contention between the Jewish people. There were those who wanted to just go along with the Antiochus, and then there were those who wanted to stay faithful to the Torah, right? What else is going on here?
One more thing. Same is true today.
Yeah, same is true today, right? Right. What else does this text tell us? So what did Antiochus and his military do? They entered into Jerusalem, and what did they do? Right, they stripped everything of value from the temple. Remember, when you read about the building of the temple, is that things were plated in gold, things were hammered gold, right? When people made donations to the temple, it went into a treasury so that they could pay for the upkeep of things. And then what happened? He stole that too, right? And what it doesn't tell us in this particular text is they end up defiling the temple itself, that they go into the Holy of Holies and they establish a statue of Zeus. And on the altar, they sacrifice a what? A pig, right? All right, so let's see. You know what? Let's just do this anyway. Let's look at text number 2. All right, so read that in your group, discuss it, and then we'll talk about what's going on here. text number 2, where it says 1 Corinthians, I'm sorry, 1 Corinthians, 1 Maccabees 4. Do you guys need another one? You sure? All right, so discuss in your little groups, once you've had a chance to read it, what's going on here. Like what stands out to you, what you think is interesting, what you think is surprising. Well, go ahead and in your groups, like discuss it first, and then we'll discuss it as a group. So in your little chavrutot, about 3 years. Because in 165, they got control over Jerusalem again. So from 168 to 165. But they mentioned that there had been 2 years in another text, 2 years since the temple was defiled. And so for 2 years, there was no worship in the temple. It might be on the next one. All right, so what's going on in 1 Maccabees 4, in this passage that I gave you from 1 Maccabees 4? What's going on? Uh-huh. Something similar to the days of Elijah, right? Okay. Okay. He's saying he sees something similar to the description of in the days of Elijah. You want to explain that a little more?
The 450 priests of Baal were killed. Remember, and he had to fix the altar. There was no temple, but there was an altar.
There was an altar.
Yes.
Right. Okay. What else? What's going on in this text that you see? What else is going on?
They were rebuilding what was taken away from them and destroyed. The enemy tried to destroy, but they still had hope and faith to renew and rebuild, and they came up with that menorah. So what the enemy intends for evil, God turns around for good, and that's part of our portion with Joseph, what took place and what he told his brothers. So that's what comes to my heart.
Yeah. So what's going on here? What's going on? So what did you guys say?
Exactly what she
Exactly what she said. Okay. So Teresa.
For 8 days, they celebrated. They had offerings,
Right.
and they exclaimed joy. And this is when Hanukkah began. They decreed
Right.
that this day would be celebrated every year for Hanukkah.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to look at one more text in a second, which will explain why they celebrated for 8 days. But what do they do? So first, Judah and those who were with him, they go into the temple, which for 2 years had not had any worship in it, right? And they come in and they start to clean it up, and they see just how defiled the sanctuary had become. And so what do they have to do? They had to purify everything. And so what do they have to do with the altar? Because remember, a pig was sacrificed on it. So you can't just like wash it down. Like it's been completely defiled, right? Because if you understand the laws of kashrut, right, if something, like even cooking things with something that is ritually impure, it makes it not kosher. And so we're talking about not just, your plates, your dishes and stuff. This is the holy altar. So what do? They tore it down, and they have to rebuild it, and they have to rebuild it with unhewn stones, meaning that these are stones that were not worked, right? They were not turned, square or whatever. And what do they do with the the original stones of the altar? They stowed it away somewhere on the Temple Mount until when? A prophet could come and tell them what to do with it. What's interesting in Jewish tradition about this particular prophet? So one of the things that the Messiah is supposed to do is be the prophet, right? There are 3 things that Moses was that the Messiah will be: a judge, a king, and a prophet, right? In the same one figure. And so one of the things that, according to Jewish tradition, is that the Messiah will be the great halachic decisor. In a time when even the greatest sages of a generation don't know what to do, the prophet, meaning the Messiah, will come and eventually tell them what to do. So all the great sages at this time don't know what to do. What do you do when the temple, when the temple has become defiled and you can't even use the altar? We know that we can't use that altar, so we have to build another one, but you can't. This was something that was holy. You can't just throw it away. So what do? And they can't answer it. So they take the stones, they put it on, in a pile somewhere on the Temple Mount, and they leave them there because they can't just throw them away, right? This was for the altar, right? In the Holy Temple in Jerusalem until the prophet will come. And then they have to make new vessels, right? They have to make new menorah and the different vessels that are used in the worship during the sacrifices and the offerings, because the other things were taken, right? So they have to make new things. All right, in your groups, look at text number 3, because I want to get into why they celebrate for 8 days. All right, so text number 3. So read this and then discuss it among your group. Why are they observing the festival of Hanukkah for 8 days? All right, discuss in your little chavrutot, your little chavrusa groups, why are they celebrating this rededication of the temple for 8 days? They didn't just, randomly choose 8. Because they could have celebrated for a week, right? Which would be 7 days. Why 8 days? Why do they celebrate Hanukkah for 8 days? What does the text say? What does the text say? What does the text say? Why do they celebrate for 8 days? Rabbi Tony.
Them of Sukkot.
Exactly. Right. So for 2 years, there was no worship in the temple. So when they re-purify the temple and everything is ready that they can worship again, when is it? It's December, right? When is Sukkot? It's a few months earlier, in the month of Tishrei. So the most recent festival that they couldn't observe, remember? Because what they want to do is they want to celebrate before the Lord. This is a joyous occasion. So they're reminded of what is the last holiday that we could not celebrate? Sukkot. How many days is Sukkot? 8 days. And what do? They wave, they come with their lulav and etrog. They circle the temple, and they sing what? Hallel. It's the Psalms of Praise, which we always do on festivals. So what they do is they reenact the celebration of Sukkot for 8 days. But they decide at the end of that we're going to make this a new holiday called Hanukkah, right? And we're going to celebrate this for 8 days. So I want you to discuss in your groups, your little chavrutot, what is missing in this story that you're used to hearing? Don't read on. Please don't read the next text yet. What do you not see in any of the passages I gave you from Hanukkah? From the books of Maccabees. From the books of Maccabees, discuss in your groups, what do you not see? All right, so what do you not see in the account in the Maccabees? What is missing that we are used to telling when we tell the story of Hanukkah today? What's missing? The miracle of oil. Exactly. Right. According to the story most of us know today, why do we celebrate Hanukkah for 8 days? Because it took 8 days to make new oil, right, to relight to keep the menorah burning for 24 hours. But according to Maccabees, which is the oldest account and is very similar to the account of Josephus, why is Hanukkah 8 days? Because of Sukkot. That was the most recent festival that they could not celebrate, and therefore, that's why it's 8 days. So where does the story of the oil come from? It comes from the rabbis. So it's recorded first in the Babylonian Talmud. Actually, it might be in the Jerusalem Talmud. That I should check. But most of us know it from a passage in the Babylonian Talmud, which is about from 3 to 500. So you're talking about at least 800 years later. Now, this could have been just an oral story that was passed down. I don't know. But the first mention of it is here. And so the Talmud tells us, my Hanukkah, it asks this question. This is a very famous sugya, a very famous passage in the Talmud called my Hanukkah. What is the reason for the festival of Hanukkah? Ditanu Rabbanan, the rabbis say, B'chaf He Kislev, Yomei de Hanukkah, Damina Einon. For the rabbis taught on the 25th of Kislev, commence the days of Hanukkah, which are 8, and on which eulogizing the dead and fasting are forbidden. So even though it's not a major holiday according to Jewish law, it's made kind of a big deal in the United States because it's supposed to kind of compete with Christmas. But according to Jewish tradition and in the rest of the world, like if you go to Israel, this is a work week, right? People come home in the evening and they'll light candles and tell the Hanukkah story and pass out gifts, but it's not a Yom Tov, meaning you can work, you can do whatever you want. But there are certain things, because of it's a festival, that we don't do. We don't do eulogies. So if somebody does have to be buried, you can't make a big deal out of them because you're supposed to be joyous, right? What is the other thing you can't do during Hanukkah? Fast, right? Because you're supposed to be joyous. You're supposed to rejoice in this festival. And because it's a festival, we also then recite Hallel, right? We recite the Hallel Psalms for all 8 days of Hanukkah. All right, so it goes on to tell us, for when the Greeks entered the temple, they defiled all the oils therein. And when the Hasmonean dynasty prevailed against and defeated them, they made search and found only one cruse of oil, which lay with the seal of the high priest, but which contained sufficient oil for 1 day's lighting only. Yet a miracle happened, and they lit the lamp with it for 8 days. The following year, these days were appointed a festival with the recitation of Hallel and thanksgiving. So this is where the origin of the miracle of oil is first mentioned. Now again, could it have been something that was passed down according to Jewish tradition? Sure. But we just don't have it mentioned in the books of Maccabees. Now, again, when I tell this story to my kids, I'm going to add the story of the oil and everything, because that's what we do, right? But I think it's important as adults, when we look at the text, what's going on, right? What is the story according to Maccabees, which is the most reliable accounts, along with Josephus, that we have of this period, versus what is tradition, right? There's so much that we can call urban legends or traditions that get passed down throughout Jewish history, but it's interesting to kind of see. I wasn't until I was in college that I realized, because of the lecture of a rabbi in a Hebrew school a Reformed synagogue that I was working at when I was in college, when he pointed this out, he was doing a chapel on a Sunday morning with the kids in the Hebrew school, and when he mentioned this, I about dropped my jaw, because what do you mean? My whole life, I've never heard this before, right? What? And so when I went and checked, he was right. So any other thoughts, questions, comments?
Yeah, the way I see it, it's a picture of the end times. Antiochus is the Antichrist, the foreshadowing of what will happen. And if you read through it, what you'll see is the miracle is God overcomes Antiochus through willing people, through the Maccabees. Maccabees weren't righteous by any means. They were just willing to be used by God. They fought among themselves, and there was after the Maccabees that it led the Hasmonean dynasty. There were problems there. It wasn't like it was all, but anyway, God used those who were willing. And the end of days, there will be another Antichrist coming who will remove the worship of God from what may be a rebuilt temple. There'll be Jews who follow the Antichrist. And so it's all a foreshadowing, a picture. And in the end, if you look at the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, a mountain is cut out, not by human hands, and destroys this evil kingdom. And so I see it as a picture. That's the real miracle. It's a picture of the end times.
It's one way to view it, but it's definitely can be like an archetype for that. In fact, there are many scholars that believe that Daniel is actually, when it talks about the abomination that causes desolation, is actually referring to the desecration of the temple at the time of the Maccabees. So it all depends on when you date Daniel. Daniel is actually very late, but the question is, how late do you want to push it? But clearly, it's interesting that if you want to make those connections. So even though there could be some application to the end times, Daniel could be referring to the destruction of the actual temple in his lifetime, or at least in the lifetime of the author of Daniel. Any other questions, comments? Josh?
Yeah, I remember when I was in Israel learning about a story of a Hannah, there's many, and that she had, it was either 7 or 8 sons that were arrested by the Antiochus' forces, and kind of like, I guess they were told to do something idolatrous, like eat this pork or something. Yeah, and then each one was, kind of sacrificed themselves for the sanctity of God and were killed. And so I've heard that also applied to, it's like a darker, way to count numbers of like 8, but that somehow there's association with that as well with like, I guess my point is that like other occurrences may have been happening that were people find ways to attribute them to the meaning and association with the holiday as well.
Yeah, people throughout history have always taken things in the biblical account and then try to make sense of it in their time, right? We see this in the Second Temple period that people are doing, applying these things because they believe they were in the end times, right? Even when you read the New Testament, that most of the authors are writing saying, in our lifetime, the Messiah will return, right? They thought that they were living in that time. So anyway, I hope this has been interesting to see. I would encourage you that, in the next 4 days, tonight we'll light the 4th candle. And in the coming rest of Hanukkah, do you have a question? All right, one more question and then we've got to wrap it up. Okay.
I want to know why the story came from the rabbi. The story.
The rabbis? Again, we don't know. So the easy, which I don't think is a fair answer for all kinds of reasons, is you could argue that they just made it up. I don't think so. I think that they're relying on some kind of a tradition when they're writing this stuff down. So I don't think that they completely made it up, but what is interesting is that it's not until hundreds of years later that we actually get this story of the oil. Right, because it's not recorded in any of the books of Maccabees. So I think what they're probably doing is they're developed a tradition, whether it's literal or not, that was passed down and that the rabbis recorded. Because the rabbis recorded as though this is the way that it was, right? And I think obviously other people would have said, this is not the way that it happened, but they had heard the story too and nobody questioned it. We don't have any writings of anybody saying that the rabbis are wrong, right? Instead, it's like they recorded something that, as the story gets passed down, could have been embellished or something, or you can also believe by faith that this is something that was a miracle that happened when they rededicated the temple. It just wasn't included in the books of Maccabees. It's a possibility. Okay. Is it end time stuff or is it? All right. Okay.
Sort of. As believers, Yeshua declares himself the light of the world.
Right. Of course. Yeah. And I was going to get in, and if we had more time, I wanted to actually look at the stuff of Yeshua. Because obviously Yeshua declares himself the light of the world. And let me just kind of wrap up what I was thinking of. I don't think that it's an accident. If we look at the passage that we read from earlier in John chapter 10, it's no accident that Yeshua chose the beginning of Hanukkah to proclaim his messiahship as well as his deity. In addition to being a festival of dedication, Hanukkah is also known as the Festival of Lights. This is why in modern Hebrew it's also called Chag HaUrim, the Festival of Lights. And for example, in addition to this, in John chapter 8, Yeshua spoke to them again saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light which gives life, right? And Yeshua is what he's doing, the light of the world, was actually what the menorah in the temple was called. Why? Because the temple in Jerusalem was the highest point in the city, right? The city is already on a hill, but at the height of the hill is the Temple Mount. And at Herod's time, when he expands the temple and does a massive building project in the temple, the Heichal, the central part, is made of white marble. So when this huge menorah that is a couple stories tall is lit, it reflects off the white marble in the temple and this is the light that shines on a hill, right? It's a reference to the temple. But the light of the world is the menorah, right? So when Yeshua says, I am the light of the world, it's no accident. He's comparing himself to the light of the menorah, which shines in the temple, right? At that time, when Yeshua spoke these words, our people were living under Roman occupation and oppression. They desperately needed a message of hope, which is not too different than today. As followers of Messiah, we are also called to reflect that light, to reflect the light of hope and redemption. Hanukkah ultimately recalls the triumphant events, as we read of the Maccabees, and the rededication of the temple in Jerusalem following its desecration by the forces of Antiochus and the Syrian Greeks in the 2nd century BCE. As we know, the festival of Hanukkah recalls two primary miracles. According to tradition, what are they? The defeat, right? The defeat of the Syrian Greeks and the rededication of the temple, and the miracle of oil, which lasted for 8 nights. Now, tyrants and enemies cannot quench the Jewish spark, nor the light of Mashiach, the light of Messiah within each one of us. As we commemorate the rededication of the Holy Temple, may we also use this time to rededicate ourselves to a living a life of Torah, of service unto Hashem, and ma'asim tovim, acts of loving kindness towards all. For just as our ancestors, the Maccabees, overcame the forces of an enemy power, so too are we able to overcome the forces in life that work against us. So, happy Hanukkah and Shabbat Shalom. Chag Sameach.